All right, welcome to The Empire Never Ended with Boris, Fritz, and Ray. We are recording this episode on the 25th of February, on Friday. A little late for the patrons, but we wanted to get together and have something cogent to say about what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, we're not a current affairs podcast by any stretch of the imagination, but I mean, I think we've had over the past few months a lot of questions regarding like far right movements in Ukraine and the like. And I don't know, I mentioned like maybe it would be good to do like an arc on Russia and Ukraine sometime in the future, but like,
so it starts now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I had some plans before the events of, yesterday came up, like because I have been for many years like reading Russian and Ukrainian like far right material, going back I think even before 2014, but then especially in 2014 because Ukraine was kind of a turning point for a lot of far right movements in Europe, and so it's kind of an important thing to understand when talking about like European Nazis and the like. But at the same time, it's a difficult question to get into, I think, for us right now because, well, I mean, things are changing so much and there's a lot of propaganda and all kinds of bullshit. So, I mean, I think, I don't know, I'm going to try to refrain from offering any like hot takes or geopolitical analysis because fuck that. I mean, I think we're all on the same page in that, like, a lot of us have, like, friends and comrades in Ukraine and Russia and Belarus and stuff. So, yes, they don't give a fuck about your geopolitical analysis because they're going through some shit right now.
Yeah, also, you don't go to the podcast that's just about to start, like, a block on Ezra Pound for that.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, tune into, what people are saying from over there because they know the situation a lot better than us.
Yeah.
So my impression was I found it interesting how this started. The invasion started or was prepared or announced by Putin's speech that he gave, I don't know, 2 days ago, 3 days ago. I'm getting confused.
Well, it was the one that announced the war was yesterday morning.
Yeah, the first
time.
one before that.
The preamble.
Which was possibly recorded on the same day as the second one because he had the same suit and tie.
Somebody noticed that like there was a watch set to like a time that was before it was released, so that all that shit was pre-recorded.
Yeah. So I found it interesting, like just because of how like it's a good example of like nationalism, how it doesn't make a lot of sense, and some of typical ideological points of a nationalist ideology, and how in that way it was very similar to Balkan stuff that we know more about, and how it was framed in the wars in the 90s. So I didn't go into like some careful analysis of what Putin was saying, but the whole idea of him basically kind of denying like a separate historical right for the existence of Ukraine, and saying how it's a part of Russian history, saying how we are one people, but basically meaning like we are Russians or something like this, or like even if there are separate people, they're a kind of Russians, basically.
In Russian nationalist discourse, the Ukrainians are usually referred to as Little Russians.
Yeah. So and so that's one thing, because we have ancient history that we share, and our roots, Russian roots, are in that territory, referring, I guess, to Kiev and Rus.
Yeah,
like a polity that literally existed 1,000 years ago.
Yes,
and also like. Which, I mean, you can barely call it a state. It's like what a polities, kind of polities that you had in Middle Ages, which were definitely not nation states.
Yeah.
And which was like, by the way, ruled by a dynasty which was called the Rurik dynasty. And, and the whole kind of ruling caste of that polity was made of people who were called Varangians, which is an old Slavic word for Vikings.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you go by that logic of historical rights, I guess Sweden should control
Ukraine,
Russia and Ukraine.
Well, they have a similar color layout, don't they?
Yeah,
flag-wise.
So it doesn't make any sense. And then the other thing was like how actually, Ukraine was created by Lenin and so on. It's a communist, it's a made up nation. Like a nation can be anything else but made up. So this whole thing is kind of dumb. The whole idea, that you have like natural nations that grow on a tree, and then you have made up nations created by Western empires and communists.
Yeah.
And this is kind of similar to the Balkan narrative. Like often you would hear things like that. I don't know how many listeners of ours like watch televised trials of Balkan war criminals in the Hague Tribunal.
I'm guessing 70%.
Yes, but that's kind of that's a very, for example, Serbian war criminals would often give speeches like that. So they would say,
No.
well, actually, in 17 blah blah blah, and this proves that the Albanian nation was actually created. It's a fake nation created by the Austrian Empire, and the people from the court would be like, well, sir, maybe we are actually talking about this bus of Albanian civilians that you ordered all murdered and buried in a mass grave. So maybe concentrate on that. So a lot of bullshit like that, and this really reminded me of that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You see that with the maps too. If you look at the Russian nationalist media, and the map that Ukraine does exist, but it's very small. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The rest of it, and that's that really reminded me of, especially some of the Serbian nationalist discourse about Croatia, for example. When Šešelj says there was a Croatian nation, and it's basically just Zagreb. And the surroundings and everything else is historically Serbian land or whatever.
But what's not small compared to Russia? That's not fair.
Right. Yeah. A massive land empire that is not comprised completely of Russians.
Yes.
I mean, yeah. No, I mean, in the second speech, I started to see a little bit more of, he talked about, in the first one, he talked about decommunization, right? That this is, the artificial creation of Lenin and the communists' nationalities policy, and that they made concessions to Ukrainian nationalists and gave them territory beyond their wildest dreams. And that if they wanted, decommunize and take down all the statues of Lenin and erase the Soviet legacy, then, here it goes. We'll take away territory that the Soviets, quote unquote, gave Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the real decommunization.
Yeah, that's the real
Ukraine, basically. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But that hints at a little bit at what he would then say in the speech that announced the war, which was that their objective is to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine.
Yeah.
And this is the thing that we kept seeing. I mean, over and over again is this focus on the presence of the far right in Ukraine, ranging from the veneration, official veneration of collaborationists and genocidaires like Stepan Bandera and other such figures from Ukrainian history, to the Azov battalion and the right sector and all those forces that we saw pretty prevalent in the first war in 2014 and Maidan and the like. And that's where I don't know, we got a lot of questions specifically about Azov, and there's kind of a big focus on that. And there's a reason for that. I mean, it is very real. They are real things. I think that there was an effort, at least I noticed in the last couple months, to kind of de-emphasize their power and role in events, which, on the one hand I understand, and people would also point out Russia's full of Nazis too. And I understand that because, ultimately the Azov battalion is 1,000 people. Ukraine has 45 million people. There's certainly a far more diverse set of political options than is being presented by, Russia, which says that Ukraine is literally a fascist state. And they did have parties, super far right parties that were in power that now don't have as many seats. And that, I understand all that. It still kind of misses the point though, in that we shouldn't de-emphasize those groups, because as the situation intensifies and gets worse, I think that, that's only going to strengthen this really radical nationalist position, both in Russia and Ukraine. But there are some major tendencies to understand within the far right movements in Ukraine and also in Russia, which is that, I don't know, I think they can be roughly split in both sides, both in Russia and Ukraine, into kind of conservative nationalist fascism and this kind of, how do we say it, like
White
radical
nationalism, no?
Yeah, I'd say like kind of a radical, almost like revolutionary, like racial program. And this is like, I think roughly how, and this is speaking very broadly, how you could break down the strains of the far right in Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah.
Because on like the conservative side, you have, the kind of traditionally religious, that is following traditional religions, whether it's, the Orthodox churches in Ukraine or even the like Byzantine Catholic churches and the Catholic Church and the like. And that, kind of look to 19th century and like 20th century examples of like Ukrainian nationalism as their model. And that's, of course, like Bandera and Petliura and all these other people. But on the other side, and this is kind of where like Right Sector and all these other groups come in, they follow kind of more pan-Slavic, pagan, national socialist. And there's, of course, there's a lot of different strains there, too. I'm really giving kind of the basics there. And in Russia, you have something similar, right? In Russia, you have their examples that they look to, like that anti-communists look to, or, radical nationalists, is either, pre-Soviet Russia, so like the Russian Empire, and, there's like the Russian imperial movement is like a good example of that. And there's other ones as well. And, they follow this kind of orthodox autocratic line that, they believe that basically in the Russian Empire, and they use the imperial flag, the black, yellow, and white one. And it was a pretty major force there. And you can roughly also put in like things like Eurasianism and Dugin and all that kind of stuff into that camp, roughly.
Yeah, there are people who like both the Russian Empire and Stalin.
Yes. And then in Russia, too, you have this kind of more modern, racial, revolutionary, pagan, pan-Slavic national socialism. And that breaks down roughly into how they look at Ukraine in Russia, especially. So these kind of pro-imperial Orthodox fanatics are all
maybe we
for,
can call them like, maybe those are like Russian fascists and the other ones are like neo-Nazis, really?
Yeah. Like Russian fascists do support like the efforts to, take over Ukraine and supported the separatist republics and the annexation, and they sent people to fight, and they had their own militias, and they were pretty active on that front. But I think what a lot of people don't really know about is that on the neo-Nazi side in Russia, a lot of them actually support Ukraine. They think, the Ukrainian side, they think that it's like a more genuine expression of like Slavic nationalism, that they are also Slavs and that they are seeking to like destroy Jewish influence that controls both of their like states. And so when you read like Telegram channels, for example, from that side, you get this very like pro-Ukrainian militia, anti-government in Russia. They're very much against Putin. They very much think that he's like a neo-Soviet, puppet of Jewish interests that works too much to support like non-white minorities and is importing like Central Asian labor to replace Russians and all of the cities and major industry and stuff like that. And so on that side, you have a considerable amount of like Russian Nazis that went in 2014 to fight on the Ukrainian side. In some of those militias that we talked about. So not just like Azov, but some of the other kind of, there's like the Misanthropic Division and all these other ones that are like more explicitly pagan, Slavic nationalist, whatever. I mean, we've talked, I think even before on the show of that Russian black metal band, the famous like Nazi one, Malot.
Yeah.
They like straight up moved to Ukraine. You know what I mean? So there is that tendency as well that I think maybe people don't know too much about. But even on that like imperial side, it's interesting because Putin used all this rhetoric of decommunization and blaming the communists like for everything. You'd think that this would kind of appeal generally to the far right in in Russia. But what I could see from Telegram is actually pretty interesting. So, some of them would be like, yes, he says this, but that's just because he's trying to appeal to like, the true like Russian nationalist. He's still like, Jew controlled Bolshevik at heart or something like that. And some of them were denouncing him for that. But that is...
So that's the Russian Nazi galaxy brain is
yeah.
Putin agrees with me because he's controlled by my enemies.
Yes, but some of those guys, of course, are still instruments of the Russian state, and like the Russian state definitely utilizes Nazis in a very particular way that I think isn't talked about as much as how like the Azov battalion, for example, is like a part of the Ukrainian military officially. Russia like uses those militias, these far right militias in Donetsk and Lugansk in very similar ways, and historically, if you know anything about like anti-fascist activities in Russia, a lot of fascists in Russia are very tied to like security structures, the police. There's lots of stories and accounts of like anti-fascists getting like taken to a police station where like a Nazi's waiting for them to beat the shit out of them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like that kind of stuff, and they use them in that way, and that's an important thing to remember. Very recently, like in the last year, I think, one of the main advocates for the separatist side in Ukraine was like this Russian Nazi who very much supported and fought in like Donetsk in 2014. He later switched sides against Putin and was killed for it. So he was like thrown out of a window in Vladivostok, and like officially the police say that he killed himself. Mm-hmm. But if you read like Russian Nazi telegrams, they very much say that like, people could hear like an argument going on in the apartment, and then all of a sudden, he was thrown out the window. So,
maybe he was arguing with himself. He had like a Gollum situation.
Yeah. But like some of that brings you to this kind of really weird Nazi anti-war sentiment, which we definitely saw in 2014. And this is definitely like how the war in Ukraine kind of made far-right options in Europe have to choose a side, basically.
Yeah, it's a proper crisis.
And so you'd get this kind of crazy shit like Nazi anti-war graffiti.
Yeah, no more brothers' wars.
No more brothers' wars.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Some of those. You see some of those on like Nazi telegrams, especially in places like Serbia and stuff where they really can't choose. They really don't know who to choose because they have the same problem, right? They're want to be pro-Russian, and lots of like Serbian fascists went and fought on the pro-Russian side, but now like Ukraine is popular with Nazis everywhere else in Europe, and so some of them have to be Ukrainian, and so pro-Ukrainian. So instead, they've chosen to go for the anti-war option. So this is where you see like peace, no war between brothers. Like I saw this picture of a mural in Serbia, I think, which is like the Russian and Ukrainian flag with like the Celtic cross in the middle, and like no more brother wars and like hearts and stuff like that. Like it's just, it really like brings you this kind of like absurdity that you have like anti-war Nazis who are just like, yes, the Jews control both sides. We have to advocate for peace, or like, at least for the rights of self-defense for Ukrainians and the like. And it's thoroughly bizarre. And I mean, I've just surveying some stuff from Russia now. I saw some of this, definitely. But then, of course, like I said, there's a significant both pro-separatist side and pro-Ukrainian side. I saw a picture posted yesterday in a Russian Nazi telegram, kind of one of the bigger channels. They're kind of still on the kind of Orthodox side. They're not like straight up like mostly neo-pagans, but like very much anti-communist in the sense that Russia needs to be fully decommunized, and they identify heavily with like the whites and the Civil War and stuff, and are crazy anti-Semites. And but they posted a picture of a guy presumably in Ukraine who has both a Ukrainian flag patch and a patch of the ROA, which we talked about a little bit in our episode about the little anti-communist Orthodox churches. The ROA being the Russian Nazi collaborationist force during the Second World War. So clearly, there's some of that going on too. Like this guy is in Ukraine. He has a Ukrainian flag and a Russian fascist and a Russian Nazi patch on his jacket, and he's like on a tank somewhere. Yeah, so there's it's a lot to wrap your head around. And like I said, I think the biggest tragedy out of all of this, and like this is something that for some of us who saw what went down in the breakup of Yugoslavia, is that there's just not going to be a good side in this. Like it's going to strengthen all the worst people and all the worst positions, and it's going to like force people to have to identify with people that they might not have otherwise identified with, because in Ukraine there's no choice right now. Like you're being conscripted. There's like conscription with no age limit for males, and
and the border was closed for men between ages of 18 and 60. They can't leave Ukraine now.
Yeah. And like you see this with like, I saw some of this discourse around like the phrase Slava Ukraini, Geroyam Slava, which is like this kind of nationalist greeting in Ukraine, and people being like, well, yes, it might have this kind of fascist connotation, but like it's uniting us right now. And it kind of reminded me of like some of what you like saw in Croatia in the 90s, for example. Like Thompson, who we talked about in our music episode, didn't become like a star overnight. He became a star because he was like representative of like Croatia's defense against the aggressors and all that kind of stuff. So you had like really kind of middle of the road people who would use like fascist salutes because they associated it with this kind of self-defense and the like. And that's, I think, exactly what's going to happen, unfortunately, in Ukraine and Russia. Like, because that rhetoric is going to ramp up significantly, because this is kind of a point of no turning back. In some ways. So it's, this is a defeat, like for like anti-war position, of course, and it's very difficult to say now. Like it's impossible to say now to like advise people in Ukraine what to do when you have war, in the streets of Kyiv, and it's an extremely difficult situation, and kind of we already lost there. But at least maybe I would like to try to say to the people outside of Ukraine and Russia, especially in the West, that especially leftists, that maybe they should restrain themselves from like supporting a side in a nationalist conflict, like because they want to do something. I think that's like a bad thing to do, and it usually has horrible, like people say all kinds of stupid things maybe without thinking enough. Some are serious, some are not. Some talk openly like maybe Ukraine should be divided into areas, maybe this part should be absorbed in this state or that state or things like that, and like without really acknowledging how much any of these solutions that they discuss really, it consists out of a lot of misery and death and destruction for a lot of poor people. So I think that's like we shouldn't like even talk in such a way. And if you really want to, like if you think that you matter in this conflict in some way and want to be a part of it in some way, there are always groups in wars that resist war or are organized based on mutual aid and are doing good things. Some are political, some are not at all. So you can always reach out to them and help them. And I think we'll provide links in the description of this episode. So we'll provide a link for you, for example, where you can support in money the anarchists who are organizing in Ukraine and help them with transportation, necessary goods, and medical supplies. On the other hand, we'll also provide a link so that you can donate money for anti-war protesters in Russia who are currently being oppressed and arrested for protesting the war there. Yeah, I was looking at a lot of that footage and pictures coming out of Russia and statements coming from various different cities, including like a lot of smaller cities in Russia that you don't really hear as much about. I mean, there were big protests in Moscow and St. Petersburg, obviously, but there were also, significantly large protests in cities like Pan and Novosibirsk, I think even like Irkutsk, I saw some stuff. And I mean, those people are facing pretty strong repression just for like being out on the streets. Like in the one account, I think from Perm, the guy was saying that like, as soon as you pull out a flag or a banner of any kind, the police just jump on you and that's it. Like, they gather, but as soon as you pull out a sign or something, you're in the back of, you're getting hauled out by police and stuff. So, I mean, they're facing some pretty serious challenges right now. And this is like, again, the thing that kind of annoys me the most about like this armchair geopolitics bullshit that you see on like Twitter and like on the internet from, and I would like to emphasize not just Western leftists, because if you want to see some really nuclear, like bad takes, you can take a look at what Eastern leftists also say, because a lot of it is just as stupid. But like, unless you read stuff in those languages, you're not gonna see those takes as much. So there are really bad takes kind of throughout the world from these kind of like armchair geopolitics leftists. And it's like important to remember that, like what Ray said, I mean, there's the solutions that you're offering don't do shit for anybody on the ground who are like suffering currently. You know what I mean? Like, and the same goes for any kind of like sloganeering or like judging of like what's going on right now for people on the ground. Cause it's like, it's easy to say, I don't know, I have this firm position, even if like, whatever. And then, somebody's getting like pulled off a bus and like sent to the front or something without any choice of their own. You know what I mean? Or like, we should carve up Ukraine. What's that mean for, speakers of different languages and stuff like that? Like if the Russians thought that like Ukrainianization is bad, it's only going to get worse now. You know what I mean? Because now, and like, I don't know. It's just, I think a lot of people don't really think about what the implications of that are. And it's not good, no matter which way you cut it.
Yeah. I mean, people are saying horrible shit. Like, I even saw like a comment somewhere on social media for someone, I guess, who has a kind of, I don't know what their opinion, but they were, I guess, roughly anti-imperialist. But even this person was saying, well, at least this will provide for great episodes of my favorite podcast or something like this, which is like such a, I mean, like, okay, I'm glad like the death of, Eastern Europeans is at least making your life a little less boring or something like this. And this is somehow normal for people to talk like that. And I think it's horrible.
I'm glad you're going to have entertainment on your commute to work.
Yes. And maybe that's a joke or not, but you shouldn't say that in any way, because it's just, I mean, that actually is contributing in a bad way to our misery. Like if you spread a discourse like that, like if you really have any kind of position that wants to be in solidarity, with the proletarians and poor people of the world, you should always keep in mind what's happening to them and talk from that. Use that as a starting point, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And as far as like, I mean, I've seen shit that like a lot of people were trying to wrap people that would like supported Putin or whatever thought Russia was like this force of, anti-fascism in the world, were really trying to wrap their head around, Putin literally blaming all the woes of Russia and Ukraine on Lenin and the communists.
Yeah, well, he's really, against extremism on both sides.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and then people being like, well, maybe, I guess denazification of Ukraine is a good thing. And like I've said a million times already today, that is not going to happen. Like if you think it was bad before, it's not going to get any better. No. Like, you have people will identify with the guys who fight. And that's why these guys were popular in the first place, is that, they were like willing to go out and fight and be tough. And, if I'm looking at their like Telegram channels now, and they're just straight up mobilizing. They're just saying, now is the time. Welcome to hell. That welcome to hell is, I guess, a slogan that they like putting. I've seen it on like a couple different groups, different like fascist paramilitaries in Ukraine. And like, they're sending instructions on how to make Molotovs, how to disable a tank. And when you have this situation in which like, a city is being defended by those people, a lot of people are going to identify with them, no matter how shitty they are.
Mhm.
Like, I mean, in Bosnia and in Sarajevo, for example, some of the like heroes of the defense of the city were like small time criminals before the war who like also used the opportunity to like, kill people and make money and do all kinds of shit like that. But, at their funerals, 10,000 people would show up. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think with the intensity of what we're seeing there's no way that a similar thing, at least in my opinion, or from my experience at least, isn't going to happen there. I mean,
maybe by denazification of Ukraine, he just means making it Russia,
or like committing atrocities or something as like a rationale for doing whatever, Because then they paint like, Ukrainians as all Nazis, then it's pretty much open game on them. You know what I mean? And we saw that in the Yugoslav wars too, right? All Croats are Ustashas, all Serbs are Chetniks, that kind of thing, regardless of how obviously false that is.
It is a very convenient construction. Like, Ukraine is a communist like construct, but currently it's ruled by a Nazi junta. So really, to destroy it is both decommunization and denazification. And yeah, he's a liberal, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
So I was thinking about this, how to kind of critique. Not only, I want to be clear, not only like leftist anti-imperialists who feel the need to support one side in a nationalist conflict, but anyone really from the outside who has some kind of I don't know what feeling of obligation to do that, because sometimes to do that, I guess for some people means like you're dealing with reality, real politics, and so on. Although I think it's really not that. I think that it's far more real to actually support people on the ground who are trying to survive or help each other and so on.
Yeah.
So generally to critique that kind of, I think, alienated approach to, human suffering through these abstractions of nationalism and, state and war and so on. I was thinking because in 1999, I lived in Serbia when it was bombed by NATO. And so the situation was a little bit different because, in this political branding, the authoritarian regime that ruled Serbia at the time, the Milosevic regime, branded itself as a kind of a leftist, anti-globalist, anti-imperialist regime, and it was,
and fighting fascism, no?
Yes,
as well.
Yes. And it was attacked by NATO. But at the time there was a lot of these. At the time, those were kind of leftist, anti-imperialists from the West, not only from the West, from other countries as well, who were in some kind of solidarity with the regime, and the regime was and I have to say, at the time, you could, if you wanted to be kind, you could call I was a teenager, but you could say that I politically was, if you wanted to be kind, you could call me an anti-imperialist nationalist. If you wanted to be more correct, you could say that I was a kind of a national Bolshevik, which, I consider a kind of fascism. And that was me being a stupid teenager before I met, some older anarchists who thought I had, the ability to be better than that and had some patience to talk to me and so on. And this is what changed my perspectives. And not only that, just, informing myself more, reading and living, not being a stupid teenager and so on.
Well, did you have a pouch of rune stones when you were a teenager?
No.
Well, then, we all had our problems, right?
Yes. I don't feel too guilty about it. It's what it was. I wasn't an activist or anything like that. I was just being a dumb kid.
Mm-hmm.
There is this discrepancy in, your ideology and actual life. So you would expect for someone like that to be supportive of the Milosevic regime, especially while being attacked by NATO. But I had a real life experience of how this regime was horrible in a sense of repression, being, harassed by cops all the time and so on. And also looking how much it's all fake, how it's about a ruling class defending its own privileges, getting rich while the rest of us are getting poorer and poorer. so I had a lot of hate for the regime at the time. Also, not supportive of the NATO, throwing bombs at us and so on. So it's a kind of, that's how it actually is in life. It doesn't go into these ideological lines even when you want to. And I was at the time. So I said there was as I said, there were like anti-imperialist leftists in supporting the regime and coming to Belgrade and saying things like, "Well, we support your anti-imperialist resistance and so on." And at my from my perspective at the time, these were like the dumbest people on the planet at the time. Like I hated them so much because we have like these like fancy bourgeois rich grad students type people coming from the West and saying this stupid bullshit without really knowing anything what's going on and what our life was at the time. And so it's like it makes you look dumb. Like local people will think that you're dumb if you say things like that. Like regardless of their ideological position, you shouldn't do that. It's stupid to do it. And yeah,
couldn't agree more. Yeah,
there it is. Yeah.
So yes, we'll give the links if you want to help people on the ground resisting the war or trying to survive the war, and that's far better thing to do.
Wow. Man, there's some crazy shit on Telegram. Holy shit. There's this whole discourse in these like Nazi circles, both in Russia and Ukraine, that they use the term Russian Federation kind of pejoratively, as in to kind of imply like all the non-Slavic states that have like to them too many rights and equal footing. I'm reading like this telegram right now, and I saw on like the Ukrainian side, they were like, when you're fighting the Muscovites, you're not going to be fighting the Slavs, you're going to be fighting hordes of Buryats and Chechens and Yakuts and listing all these other minorities. But now I'm actually reading a Russian Nazi telegram, and they say basically the same thing. They're saying that Kiev will be like the grave of the Soviet occupier. And this is like a Russian fascist thing, and it says like, it's kind of a rough translation. Above the groupings of Chechens and Soviet soldiers, flocks of vultures anticipating a feast should now be circling. In the end, they will burn all advancing equipment and kill everyone who entered the city. Everyone understands that if Kiev becomes a mass grave for the attackers, the battle for Ukraine will be won. Now Ukraine is being frightened by Chechens, blah, 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 blah. Chechen lawlessness, Chechen tendencies. So they have this kind of idea that, Putin is waging war with the minorities to like kill the Slavs or whatever for the Jews. It's ugly. I don't know if you should keep any of that. I've been refreshing all these pages like as we go, and you just keep seeing more and more like crazy shit.
So I guess you guys hadn't seen this, but some hot news from the old Twitter there is that the Proud Boys are going through a bit of a crisis over this, I guess. I'm not sure they realize it's a crisis yet, from what I can see. So on Jordan Hopkins' Twitter, you can find a few posts from some different chapters of the Proud Boys, and they seem very confused about the plan here. One of them says that the Proud Boys of Philadelphia, the Philly Proud Boys, the PBP, the PPP.
Yes.
They're we're sending a detachment of Philadelphia brothers to Ukraine as I type this out. Their flight to Europe is set to take off in the wee hours of the morning from a location we can't disclose. So these guys are going to fight the Russians. But then there's a whole bunch of them apparently flying 8 of their best from Sydney to Poland at 4:10 tomorrow. But their intention is to go
Sydney,
help,
like Australia?
Yeah, to Poland. To go.
They have Proud Boys in Australia?
Well, that's news to me too. Yeah, but the Proud Boys Southern Tablelands is their group's name.
Huh.
Yeah, and they probably won't be there for long though. They're heading over now to help Vlad. They say. There's more. There's also groups from Texas, Oklahoma, Utah, Georgia, and Florida that are all going to stop the Chechens. So
then what? Presumably on the Ukrainian side.
presumably on the Ukrainian side, yeah. So intercontinental Proud Boys.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of. I mean, I hinted at this before, but I mean, 2014 had a major impact on the far right, especially in Europe when they had to like choose sides. I think in the U.S. and maybe other places in the Anglosphere or just farther away from Europe, they tend to view Russia as this like, and like Putin specifically as this like kind of hero of the right, whereas like a lot of right wingers in Russia hate Putin. And then they don't understand why, because they're like, well, he doesn't like gay people. And it's like, well, yeah, but you know, that's not like a particularly controversial position to have in like any political sphere in like Russia. You know what I mean? It's like a populist move to do. It has nothing to do with like what he actually feels.
I should just add too, before we continue too much, that there's no evidence apparently that any Proud Boys are going to Ukraine or Poland. They just say they are. So, but, you know, we can imagine.
Yeah, I doubt it. I don't think they're as committed as their European brethren, because like a lot of Europeans are definitely going to go on, you know, some side or another. Most likely now the Ukrainian side. Like I kind of see that people have shifted a lot more towards like the pro-Ukraine side, even before this war started. So like post 2014 to now, like people that had previously been on the Russian side are now like more pro-Ukrainian and whatever, because they don't like the like Soviet imagery and all that other shit that the separatist republics have.
Right.
But they also don't really like the fact that Zelensky's Jewish either. But
things are becoming more and more complicated for them. You know?
Yes, quite a time of crisis.
But you know, it is one of those situations that when you look at like a country from outside of it, like you tend to like connect the dots according to like official politics and stuff, which is like, you know, the right wing in America had like a huge resurgence during Obama. You know what I mean? So you could be like, I can't believe there's this like huge right-wing presence now. They have a black president. Like, it doesn't make any sense. And in fact, it makes a lot of sense. And so you kind of have, you know, something similar in Ukraine too, which like, you know, Nazis are by no means like the mainstream position necessarily, not like, you know, Slavic neo-paganism and like get fucking runes like tattooed to your face and like shit like that is not necessarily mainstream, but it's definitely there, and it will become more mainstream as shit gets worse. But like, you know, that those aren't the guys that are like out there voting for, you know, Zelensky, who's like essentially like a conciliatory figure. He was elected to kind of ease tensions. That didn't really happen. And like when you see
a war start, then
like when I look at some of the Nazi telegrams like from Ukraine, whenever they have to talk about Zelensky, I mean a little bit less so now since the war actually started. Like I noticed that they did on some of these channels like play one of his like announcements or whatever, but like a lot of the times you see like images of like, you know, because he's Jewish, like him in like a synagogue with like a kippah on, and then like a bunch of like vomit face emojis, and like shit like that. But then of course, you know, they love doing this image, like, you know, showing an image of like Putin with some like Hasidic guy, and then like some like Hasidic rabbi of Moscow, which he does. He fostered a pretty tight relationship with like Lubavitch, like Hasidic movement, Putin. I mean, so you know they always like sharing images of presidents being close to Jews, and that's a bad thing.
I mean, there's also pictures of them close to white nationalists. Like, I don't see the problem here.
Yeah. Well, you know, that thing about like fearing the Chechens is interesting, right? Because the pro-Russian side of like far-right people in Europe who are generally massively Islamophobic don't really know what to do with the Chechens, right? Because like Chechens are like the kind of the most feared to them, like, you know, lots of Chechens and Islamist movements and, you know, in like Al-Nusra and ISIS and stuff in Syria. but then like, today Kadyrov in Chechnya like was giving a speech in front of 10,000 volunteers that are being sent to the front to Ukraine, who are all like doing like Tekbir, Allahu Akbars and stuff like that. And they're like, we're going to make Zelensky like apologize to Putin and stuff like that.
Damn.
And they don't really know how to handle that reality.
Yes.
But again, this is from the outside. Like, you don't really think about that so much if you're like a Nazi in, France or, the US or wherever. Which is why if you are a Nazi in Russia, you definitely think about that. Then you're like, this is evidence that he cares more about like, the Muslims than he does about like the Slavic, white Slav who is being replaced.
It's difficult to be a fascist in the 21st century.
Yes.
So
in the age
dilemmas.
of information, especially. Yeah.
So much dilemmas. Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of weird like historical contradictions too when you look at again like Telegram and stuff like that. Lots of solidarity for Ukrainian Nazis coming from Polish Nazis, which okay, not even going into why Polish Nazi is a big historical fuck up. But then that like Polish Nazis are supporting Ukrainian Nazis who during World War II genocided the Poles from Western Ukraine is interesting. Weird. I mean, I guess they've really embraced this like not new like fascist internationalism, which is kind of the way I understand it is like we kind of are no longer we recognize borders as they exist now.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're not doing this like I think a lot of them do dream of like these irredentist ideas of like, Poland in its original territory.
As God intended Poland to be. Yeah.
But like in some of these Ukrainian Nazi like telegrams, I've seen them throwing around the idea of like rebuilding the Polish-Lithuanian like confederacy of like the Middle Ages. But as like a Nazi state, that would also include like Belarus and Ukraine. There's all kinds of like weird shit happening like that. I mean, which of course, the Russian Nazi, I mean, Polish, they're united around the fact that they hate the Russian state, but a lot of Russian Nazis are also tight with Polish ones as well, even though, there's nothing more like anti-Russian than like Poland. Like even more so than like Ukraine. I mean, it's like it's their raison d'etre. Like, it's hating Russia.
Yeah,
so,
more so than even Hungary, which has a pretty strong history of that as well.
Well, there's also nothing more anti-Polish or anti-Russian than being a Nazi, but they're all Nazis, so why not?
I mean, things are going great.
Yeah, well, it's a fucking nightmare. It's all
good news all around.
There's another weird like historical contradiction too that I was thinking about. Just like if you follow Ukrainian and like Russian far right movements, is that like today, like I said, in places like Serbia are like more kind of split as to whether they support the Russian side or the Ukrainian side, but it kind of more favors the Russian side. And like in Bosnia and Croatia, it's like very firmly pro-Ukrainian. And, that makes sense, right? In this kind of Russia is Serbia's ally and they support, the enemy. But what's interesting is that like one of the main, nationalist groups that went into right sector during Maidan in the 90s, was one of the first like Ukrainian nationalist groups to take this kind of pro-pan-Slavic turn. Some people say that it was their way of like doing a kind of conciliatory gesture towards the Russian speakers in the East, as in like to get their get on their side, good side, and foster this kind of pan-Slavic nationalism. And so as a result, there was a tendency in part of the Ukrainian far right in the 90s to support Serbia in the wars in former Yugoslavia, which is completely forgotten about now by almost everybody. Like they sent volunteers to Bosnia, they sent volunteers to Kosovo, and to fight on the Serbian side. And it's not only completely forgotten about by everybody in the Balkans, it's completely forgotten about by like Ukrainian nationalists who are now on one of these Ukrainian Nazi telegrams, I saw like a weird like meme music video of like a KLA song, Kosovo Liberation Army song. And it was, it's like this Albanian like nationalist video, but with like kind of Pepe memes with like KLA uniforms and guns. And it's like this, it's like this like Albanian song. And there's all these like Ukrainians on there being like based, like this, like weird. Like, this is great, like fuck Serbia, blah 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 blah. Meanwhile, like they're coming from a group that in the 90s sent volunteers to fight the KLA in Kosovo. Like it's completely insane. But I mean, like allegiances switch, I guess, and people quickly forget.
Yeah, sometimes very like in a very fast way. Like the French National Front sent like their members went to fight on the Croatian side in the war in the 90s. And then just a few years later, Le Pen and his like French National Front party had like very close relations with the Serbian Radical Party of Šešelj and appeared or their like conferences in Belgrade and so on. So, yeah.
Yeah, now that kind of segment of the French far right became very pro-Serbian too, right? There's that like dweebish French Nazi that became like a big humanitarian in Serbia or whatever, the one that like supports like orphans in Kosovo or something. But he comes from like a French like Nazi background. I don't know, like I think like Vučić gave him a medal or something. He's like lauded as this like big humanitarian, but he comes from I think from Nacional or maybe like the Generation Identity or whatever the fuck.
Weird.
Who, in the 90s were all pro-Croat and now are like their enemies. But I think like at least on the larger like pan-European Nazi telegram groups, there's a pretty solid support for Ukraine right now. Like they got into some bullshit earlier because Serbs and Croats got mad at each other in those groups, and some of the Serbs like rage quit because the French guys were posting pro-Ustasha stuff and that like pissed them off. But they're pretty solidly united around Ukraine. Because I guess like the real like pro-Russia guys, at least on that far right scene, aren't part of this like kind of subcultural right. They're really like Orthodox Christians and all that bullshit. And even some of those like fanatical anti-communist Orthodox churches, like we talked about in one of our previous episodes, are also not necessarily pro-Russia either, and are kind of taking a some sort of middle stance, not necessarily pro-Ukraine because
just keeping their head down.
Zelensky's a Jew, but
right,
but also not pro-Russian. So I mean, there's a lot of weird shifting alliances that have been going on since 2014 and are getting a little bit more intense now, obviously, as shit there gets worse.
Well, it's just all gonna make BitChute an even stranger place. That's all. Yeah.
Well, it's gonna make the Nazi scenes a stranger place too. I mean, hopefully, if we can, hope for anything good out of this, like maybe some of these groups will fracture a bit more and get caught up in some infighting.
Maybe
that's
not that dangerous of a prediction to make. I mean, we know their history pretty well in the show.
Yeah, I mean, but I think in recent years, especially in Europe, like a lot of these right-wing groups have had a pretty strong resurgence and have felt pretty emboldened to do actions. So, maybe this will fracture some of them. Maybe some of them will go off and die on one or the other side. That's kind of the best we can hope for.
Maybe one and then another side. Hard to tell with these guys.
I was searching for anarchist statements coming out of Russia and Ukraine, and I found this one coming out of Moscow that was translated to English. I found it on the Crime Think website, and it's a statement from the Moscow Food Not Bombs collective. So I thought maybe it would be useful to read it.
All right, yeah. So this was a hasty translation, is what Crime Think called it. Okay. We will never take the side of this or that state. Our flag is black. We are against borders and freeloader presidents. We are against wars and killings of civilians. Palaces, yachts, and prison sentences and torture for dissenting Russians are not enough for Putin's imperial gang. They should be given war and the seizure of new territories. And so, quote, defenders of the fatherland invade Ukraine, bombing residential areas. Huge sums are being invested in murder weapons while the people are impoverished more and more. There are those who have nothing to eat and nowhere to live, not because there are not enough resources for everyone, but because they are distributed unfairly. Someone has a lot of palaces, while others did not even get a hut. In order to keep and increase the benefits in their hands, the government declares wars. Who will collect their intestines with their hands? Who will have their arms and legs torn off by explosion? Whose families will bury their children? Of course, all of this does not apply to the ruling minority. We must resist the militaristic regime and the war it is waging with all our might. Spread information among your comrades, fight as best you can. No war but the class war. Solidarity instead of bombs. That's it.
To me, I think it's, you might be wondering why we're reading, a statement by a group that's probably pretty small. I think sometimes people want to find a big solution and, and that's not always there. And I think that, when you're looking at this or this kind of statement or, any of the anti-war protests, regardless of how big or small they are, it's important to read them and support them because ultimately what's very difficult in these situations is to not fall victim to the narrative that's being pushed on you. So I think it's to me at least, it's important to support people and groups regardless of how small they are that are in some way or another challenging the dominant narrative that's being pushed on them. And although it may seem kind of futile and insignificant, it does matter. It matters a lot to those people. It matters a lot to maintaining networks of solidarity that already exist. I think with radicals and leftists and anarchists and stuff in Russia and Ukraine and Belarus are very tightly connected. They were, especially, before this. And so it's important to help them try to maintain those networks as best as possible and stay out of the bullshit that's going to drive them crazy
Mm-hmm.
on the day to day. I don't know. I think that there's at least some examples that Ray and I know about of things that again may seem pretty small and insignificant in a lot of ways, but are important during the 90s wars in Yugoslavia of punks, for example, putting out anti-war compilations and albums, and at least also just maintaining communication, which fortunately is a lot easier now to do with the internet than it was back in the day. But, those networks continued to exist, afterwards. And it's important to even keep that up in some way possible. Because, you hear all kinds of small acts of solidarity that are super important. You know what I mean? Whether it means helping somebody not get conscripted if they don't want to. I know a lot of stories like that from friends in Bosnia, for example, who had the assistance of a friend or friends in non-war zone areas to get out of conscription and flee and get a at least have a place to crash and do all that kind of stuff. People sending food and money to each other, even if it is on a very small basis, it's super important. You know what I mean? So
yes.
I don't know. I said at the beginning, we're not going to offer any kind of grand takes or solutions or whatever. Just based at least on what we know, anything that challenges this narrative, the logic of a nationalist conflict is important to support, and so you should do it in any way possible.
Right on.
Yes, and also, sometimes we seem very kind of fragile and not powerful enough and so on, but also the power of the state is, I mean, often it's very strong, but often is also far less powerful than it seems. It's also an illusion sometimes. I was listening to the latest episode of the Final Straw radio show, and they interviewed Russian anarchist living in Kyiv now, and he said something that he thinks that the Putin regime is much weaker than people think, and then it seems. Then when it starts falling, it will crumble pretty fast. That's his view. I certainly have a similar experience with a similar kind of regime that it seems very overwhelming and strong, but it can disappear pretty quickly, and the state can as well, and that leaves a lot of temporary but important space for groups like the one that we read a statement from to really have even more significant role in maintaining, life, really. And that happens, even in regimes that we, to use, a liberal framework, think of like is more normal, let's say, in all kinds of situations of emergency. We have in our lifetime experiences with, all kinds of natural disasters, hurricanes, fires, floods, and so on. And we know of different autonomous grassroots groups that really took a lot of, they managed to organize a lot of networks of mutual aid that really, out of necessity, but that really saved a lot of lives and made life possible when the states failed. And this happens often. Yeah. So, these kinds of groups and ways of organizing are, I think, much more important than they want us to believe, I think. And this is also, I think, a reason why it's important to support them.
Yeah, absolutely.
By they, I, of course, mean Jews.
Yes.
I think that's how we should end the episode right there. Right? What else can be said? All right. Well, we're going to take a step back from Ukraine for the next episode, slowly get back on track with Mr. Ezra Pound in a little while. But coming up next, we got some real stupid bullshit for you that I think is right up our listeners' alley. Going back to some 09A book reports, some literature analysis.
Yes.
God!
While Slavs are waging a war against Slavs, we'll make a review of a Slavic book written by a Slav who's pretending that he's a different kind of a Slav.
Yes. So it's still thematic.
Yes.
All right. Well, see y'all then.
Bye.
Cheers.